The morning sun barely touched the dirty sidewalk outside Central Station when David Park set up his piano for another day. His fingers knew every scratch on those old keys, every broken note that stuck sometimes. He'd been playing on this same corner for 3 years now, and honestly, most days felt exactly the same. David was 28 years old and had never seen a sunrise, never watched people's faces as they walked by, never looked at his own reflection in a mirror. He'd been born blind, came into this world with darkness as his only companion. But somewhere along the way, he'd found something better than sight. He'd found music. His piano wasn't fancy. Some church had donated it when they bought a new one. The middle C was slightly flat, and the bench wobbled if you sat too far to the left. But David didn't care. When his fingers touched those keys, when the melodies started flowing from somewhere deep inside his chest, nothing else mattered. Not the cold wind that made his fingers stiff in winter. Not the rain that sometimes soaked through his jacket. Not even the thousands of people who walked past him every single day like he was invisible. Most mornings started the same way. The rush hour crowd moved like a river around him. Fast, loud, always in a hurry. Shoes clicking on concrete. Coffee cups rustling. Phone conversations mixing with honking cars and train announcements. David had learned to hear the city like a symphony, finding rhythm in the chaos that everyone else just called noise. He started playing around 7:30, always the same routine. Classical pieces first, the ones his teachers at the conservatory had drilled into him years ago, Bach, Chopin, Beethoven. The composers who understood that music wasn't just about notes on a page, it was about the spaces between the notes, the silences that made the sound meaningful. A few coins clinked into his open piano case. David nodded in the direction of the sound, said a quiet thank you that probably got lost in the city noise. He didn't play for the money, though he definitely needed it. His tiny apartment cost more than he usually made in a week, and some months he had to choose between groceries and electricity. But he played because stopping felt like dying a little bit. By 9 o'clock, the morning rush had thinned out. This was when David usually switched to his own compositions, the pieces he'd written late at night when sleep wouldn't come. These were the songs that told his story, the frustration, the loneliness, the tiny moments of joy that made everything worth it. Across the street, completely unknown to David, a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. The driver jumped out quickly to open the back door, and out stepped Vincent Hartley, wearing a suit that cost more than David's piano. Vincent was 62 years old, built an empire in real estate, and currently running 15 minutes late for a meeting that would determine a $50 million deal. Vincent hated being late. He prided himself on control, on precision, on never letting anything disturb his carefully planned schedule. His assistant was already calling his phone, probably panicking about the delayed start time. Vincent pulled out his phone to check his messages as he started walking toward his office building. That's when the music hit him. It wasn't loud or flashy. It wasn't trying to grab attention or force anyone to listen. It just existed. Floated through the air like something that had always been there, waiting for someone to finally hear it. Vincent stopped walking. His phone hung forgotten in his hand. His assistant's voice kept talking, but he couldn't hear the words anymore. The melody was sad, but not depressing. Hopeful, but not naive. It reminded Vincent of something he couldn't quite name, some feeling from long ago that he'd buried under decades of business deals and board meetings and profit margins. He felt his chest tighten, felt something warm behind his eyes that he immediately tried to push away. He looked toward the source of the music and saw him, the young man at the piano, eyes closed, completely absorbed in what he was playing. Vincent noticed the white cane leaning against the piano bench, noticed the worn jacket that had seen better days, noticed how nobody else seemed to be paying any attention at all. For maybe 2 full minutes, Vincent just stood there on the sidewalk, letting the music wash over him. People bumped into him, shot him annoyed looks, but he didn't move. He watched the young man's fingers dance across the keys with impossible precision, creating something beautiful out of an old, broken piano on a dirty street corner. Then his phone buzzed again, violently, pulling him back to reality. His assistant's panicked text filled the screen. "Where are you? The investors are here." Vincent blinked, suddenly remembering who he was, where he was supposed to be, what was at stake. He shook his head like someone waking from a dream and hurried toward his building. But that night, sitting in his empty mansion with a glass of expensive whiskey, Vincent couldn't stop thinking about that music. He'd closed the $50 million deal. He'd impressed the investors. He'd done everything right, everything he always did. But none of it felt as important as those 2 minutes on the sidewalk. He kept hearing the melody in his head, kept seeing that young blind man playing like his life depended on it. Vincent realized he couldn't remember the last time anything had moved him like that. Couldn't remember the last time he'd felt anything real at all, actually. The next morning, Vincent did something he never did. He told his driver to drop him off 15 minutes early. He stood across the street from Central Station, pretending to check his phone, and waited. At 7:30, right on schedule, the young man arrived. Someone helped him set up the piano. Looked like one of the station security guards who'd obviously done this before. And then the music started again. Vincent felt the same thing he'd felt yesterday. That tightness in his chest, that warmth behind his eyes, that sense of something lost and found at the same time. He listened to 3 complete pieces before forcing himself to walk away. This became his new routine. Every morning, 15 minutes early, standing across the street like some kind of stalker, just listening. His assistant thought he'd lost his mind. His business partners wondered why he suddenly seemed distracted in meetings. But Vincent couldn't stop. On the 5th day, he finally walked over. David had just finished playing and was stretching his fingers, getting ready for his next piece. Vincent stood there awkwardly, not sure what to say. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals with international corporations, but suddenly he felt nervous talking to a street musician. "You play beautifully," Vincent finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. David turned toward his voice, a small smile on his face. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say. How long have you been playing here?" 3 years. "Well, 3 years on this corner. I've been playing piano since I was 4 years old." Vincent noticed the details now that he was close. The patches on David's jacket, the thin frame that suggested too many skipped meals, the case that held maybe $20 in small bills and loose change. "You went to music school?" Vincent asked. David's smile got a little sad. "Conservatory, actually. Graduated top of my class 5 years ago. Lot of good it did me." Vincent found himself coming back to that corner every single day after that first conversation. Sometimes he'd just listen from across the street like before. Other times he'd walk over during David's breaks, bringing coffee or asking questions about music. He learned that David lived alone in a studio apartment 20 blocks away, that he'd applied to over 200 jobs in 5 years, that every orchestra, every concert hall, every recording studio had turned him down. "They're always polite about it," David explained one chilly afternoon, wrapping his cold hands around the hot coffee Vincent had brought. "They say things like, 'We'll keep your resume on file,' or 'We don't have any openings right now.' But I know what's really happening. They see the cane, they see the guide, and suddenly I'm a liability, a risk they don't want to take." Vincent felt anger rising in his chest. "But you're more talented than most professional pianists I've heard." David laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Talent doesn't matter much when people can't see past your disability. I had one director tell me, very kindly of course, that audiences prefer to watch musicians perform. That part of the experience is visual. He said having a blind pianist on stage might make people uncomfortable. That's ridiculous." "Maybe, but it's reality." David shrugged, his fingers unconsciously finding the piano keys, playing soft notes that matched his mood. "So I play here. At least on the street, people don't have expectations. They don't see me as anything except background noise to their morning commute." Vincent went quiet, watching those talented fingers create beauty from an old, broken piano. He thought about his own life, his massive company, his influence, his connections. He thought about how he'd spent 40 years building wealth, but had somehow forgotten how to feel anything real. This young man had nothing, no money, no security, no recognition. But he had something Vincent had lost a long time ago. He had passion. He had purpose. He had the courage to keep playing even when the world refused to listen. An idea started forming in Vincent's mind. A crazy idea that made no logical sense, that his business partners would call foolish. But the more he thought about it, the more right it felt. 3 weeks after their first conversation, Vincent showed up with a proposition that would change both their lives forever. "I have a question for you," Vincent said, sitting down on the ground next to David's piano bench. His expensive suit getting dirty on the sidewalk, but he didn't care anymore. "I'm listening," David said, finishing up a piece. "My daughter is getting married in 3 months. Big wedding, about 300 guests. Wealthy people, important people, the kind of crowd that's seen and heard everything." Vincent paused, trying to figure out how to say what he was thinking. "They're all bored, David. Bored with their lives, bored with their money, bored with each other. Nothing touches them anymore. Nothing means anything." David wasn't sure where this was going, but he stayed quiet. "I want you to play at her wedding," Vincent continued. "Not background music while people eat. I want you to perform, really perform, the way you do here. I want you to make them feel something." David's mouth opened, then closed. That's very generous, but I don't think—" "Wait, I'm not finished." Vincent's voice got stronger, more certain. "If you can do that, if you can move that crowd of 300 cynical, jaded millionaires the way you moved me on that sidewalk, I'll give you everything you need to build a real career. Connections, funding, introductions to the best concert halls in the country. Everything." The silence that followed felt heavy. David's hands had stopped moving on the keys. His face showed confusion, disbelief, maybe a little fear. "Why?" David finally asked. "Why would you do this?" Vincent took a long breath. "Because watching you play reminded me of something I'd forgotten. My father was a factory worker. Worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week just to keep food on the table. But on weekends, he'd play accordion at weddings and parties in our neighborhood. People loved him, loved his music. And I was ashamed of him." David turned his head toward Vincent's voice, listening carefully. "I spent my whole life running away from where I came from," Vincent continued, his voice getting rough with emotion. "Built this empire, made all this money, convinced myself that success meant forgetting the poor kid I used to be. I stopped talking to my father's friends. I stopped going to the old neighborhood. I even stopped listening to music because it reminded me of him." He paused, struggling with words he'd never said out loud before. "My father died 10 years ago. I didn't cry at his funeral. Didn't feel anything at all. I thought I'd won, you know? Thought I'd finally made it so far from that factory town that nothing could hurt me anymore." "But you weren't happy," David said softly. "I wasn't anything. I was just empty. Going through the motions, making money because that's what I did, not because it meant anything." Vincent stood up, brushing off his pants. "Then I heard you playing, and suddenly I was 7 years old again, sitting in our kitchen watching my dad practice his accordion, feeling proud of him instead of ashamed, remembering what it felt like to actually feel something." David's eyes were wet now. He understood what Vincent was really saying. This wasn't just about giving a struggling musician a chance. This was about Vincent trying to find his way back to himself. 300 rich people, David said, his voice shaky. "That's a lot of pressure. I know. What if I freeze up? What if I'm not good enough? You're good enough right now, playing on a broken piano on a street corner. Imagine what you could do on a proper stage." David wanted to say yes. Every part of him wanted to grab this opportunity with both hands. But doubt crept in like cold water. He'd auditioned so many times before, gotten his hopes up so many times before, only to be rejected again and again. What made this different? "Your daughter," David said. "What does she think about this?" "It's her wedding day," Vincent smiled. "I haven't told her yet. But knowing Jessica, she'll probably think I've lost my mind. She's practical like me. Like I used to be anyway. Maybe you should ask her first." "Maybe. But I'm asking you first. Will you do it?" David sat there in silence, his fingers nervously tapping the piano keys without making sound. 3 months, 90 days to prepare for the performance of his lifetime. 90 days to practice, to worry, to doubt himself. 90 days until he either succeeded or failed in front of 300 people who probably expected him to fail anyway. But then again, what did he have to lose? He was already invisible, already forgotten by the world. The worst that could happen was that he'd end up right back here on this corner, playing for spare change and cold coffee. "Okay," David finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Vincent felt relief flood through him, mixed with excitement and terror. He'd just made a promise he might not be able to keep. He'd just put his reputation, his daughter's wedding, and this young man's hopes all on the line for what? Because some music made him cry? But somehow, it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in decades. "Good," Vincent said, reaching out to shake David's hand. David found it after a second, and they shook, the millionaire and the street musician, both taking a leap of faith into something neither of them fully understood. As Vincent walked away that day, heading back to his office and his meetings and his normal life, he felt different, lighter somehow, scared but alive. He hadn't felt alive in so long, he'd almost forgotten what it was like. Behind him, David sat at his piano and started playing again. But this time, the music sounded different. There was hope in it now, fragile and uncertain, but real. People walking by noticed without knowing why. A few more coins dropped into his case than usual. Neither of them knew it yet, but they'd just started something that would change them both in ways they couldn't imagine. The hard part was still ahead. The doubt, the fear, the preparation, the moment of truth. But for now, in this moment, they both had something they hadn't had in a long time. They had possibility. The first week after Vincent's offer felt like a dream to David. Vincent hired a performance coach named Patricia, a former concert pianist who'd trained dozens of successful musicians. She came to David's tiny apartment 3 times a week, listening to him play, making notes, suggesting changes. But by the second week, the dream started feeling more like a nightmare. "You're rushing the tempo in the third movement," Patricia said during one session, her voice patient but firm. "And your left hand is overpowering the melody. The audience needs to hear the story you're telling, not just the notes." David tried again, and again, and again. Each time, Patricia found something wrong. His posture, his breathing, the way he transitioned between pieces. Things he'd never worried about before suddenly felt impossible to get right. "I've been playing my whole life," David said after a particularly frustrating session. "I've never had these problems before." "That's because you've never had this much pressure before," Patricia replied honestly. "Street performing is comfortable. You play for yourself, and if people like it, that's a bonus. But this is different. This is performance. This is 300 people who paid to be at a fancy wedding, expecting to be impressed." Those words haunted David that night, and the next night, and every night after that, he started having trouble sleeping. He'd lie in bed, his mind racing through every piece he planned to play, finding flaws in everything. His fingers would tap out rhythms on his blanket over and over, trying to memorize transitions that he'd played perfectly 1,000 times before. Some nights he didn't sleep at all, just sat at his keyboard until the sun came up, practicing until his fingers ached. Vincent noticed the change when he stopped by one afternoon. David looked exhausted, his clothes wrinkled, his face pale. "When's the last time you ate something?" Vincent asked. David had to think about it. "Yesterday, I think. I had some crackers." "David, you can't prepare for this if you're not taking care of yourself." "I can't think about food right now," David snapped, then immediately apologized. I'm sorry. I'm struggling with this." Vincent sat down heavily in the old armchair near David's keyboard. He could see what was happening, had seen it before in young executives he'd pushed too hard. The pressure was crushing David instead of motivating him. "Maybe this was a bad idea," Vincent said quietly. David's hands stopped moving on the keys. "What do you mean?" "This challenge. This whole thing. I thought I was giving you an opportunity, but maybe I'm just setting you up to fail in front of a crowd." Vincent rubbed his face tiredly. "Maybe I was being selfish, trying to fix something in myself by fixing your situation?" "You're getting cold feet?" David asked, and there was an edge to his voice now. "I'm trying to be realistic." "Look at you." "You're not eating, not sleeping." "You're making yourself sick over this." "Of course I am." David stood up, his voice rising. "This is my one shot, Vincent. My one chance to prove that I'm more than just some blind guy playing for spare change. You think I'm not terrified? You think I don't know that if I fail at your daughter's wedding, that'll be the story everyone tells? Remember that time Vincent Hartley hired a street musician who embarrassed himself in front of everyone? Vincent didn't know what to say. He'd never heard David raise his voice before. Every single day for 5 years I've been invisible, David continued, his hands shaking. Every audition, every interview, every opportunity, I've been rejected. And you know what the worst part is? I started believing they were right. I started believing that maybe I wasn't good enough. That maybe being blind meant I couldn't do this. David, and then you show up with this crazy offer and suddenly I have hope again. Which is terrifying, Vincent, because hope hurts when you lose it. David sat back down, his anger deflating into exhaustion. So yeah, I'm a mess right now. But don't you dare give up on me. I'm not giving up on myself. The silence in that tiny apartment felt thick and heavy. Vincent looked at this young man who had nothing but refused to quit, and felt ashamed of his own doubt. You're right, Vincent said finally. I'm sorry. I won't give up on you. That same evening, Vincent went home to face another problem he'd been avoiding. His daughter Jessica had been calling all week, and he'd been dodging her calls. He couldn't avoid her forever, though. Dad, what is this I'm hearing about a street musician performing at my wedding? Jessica demanded the moment he answered. She'd clearly been talking to the wedding planner. Vincent took a breath. I was going to tell you, were you? Or were you just going to spring this on me at the rehearsal dinner? Jessica's voice was sharp with frustration. It's my wedding, Dad. Mine and Robert's. Not some charity event for you to feel good about yourself. That stung because it was partially true. Vincent had been thinking about himself when he made the offer to David, trying to fix something broken inside his own chest. You're right, Vincent admitted. I should have asked you first. But Jessica, if you could just meet him, hear him play, I don't want to hear him play. I want my wedding to be perfect. I want professional musicians who won't make everyone uncomfortable. Why would he make people uncomfortable? Because he's blind, Dad. Because it's weird and awkward and people won't know how to react. Jessica paused and her voice got quieter. I know that sounds terrible. I know I sound like a horrible person. But I just want one day that's normal and perfect and not turned into some social experiment. Vincent understood her fear. He'd felt the same way his whole life, worried about what other people thought, desperate to appear perfect and in control. I'm going to tell you something, Vincent said. When I was your age, maybe a little younger, your grandfather died. You never met him. He was a factory worker who played accordion at parties on weekends. And I didn't cry at his funeral. Didn't feel anything. You want to know why? Jessica was quiet now, listening. Because I'd spent 20 years being ashamed of him. Ashamed of where I came from. I thought being successful meant pretending I grew up in a mansion instead of a 2-bedroom apartment where we could hear the neighbors fighting through the walls. Vincent's voice cracked slightly. I lost my father because I was too proud to admit I loved him. Too worried about what people would think, Dad. This young man plays piano like your grandfather played accordion, with his whole heart. And when I heard him, I remembered what it felt like to be proud instead of ashamed. To feel something real instead of just going through the motions. Vincent paused. I'm asking you, not as your father who pays for things, but as someone who loves you. Give him a chance. Meet him. If you still don't want him at your wedding after that, I'll respect your decision. Jessica was silent for a long moment. Fine, I'll meet him. But I'm not promising anything. 2 days later, Jessica showed up at David's apartment unannounced. David was in the middle of a practice session, playing one of his own compositions, completely lost in the music. He didn't even hear her knock, so she just stood in the hallway listening through the thin door. The music was beautiful. More than beautiful, it was honest. She could hear the struggle in it, the loneliness, but also the hope. It reminded her of something she'd forgotten while planning this massive wedding, that the day was supposed to be about love and connection, not just impressive decorations and expensive flowers. When David finished the piece, she knocked. He opened the door, slightly confused, and she introduced herself. Your father sent you to check me out, David said, and there was a hint of humor in his voice. Something like that. Can I come in? They talked for over an hour. Jessica asked about his music, his training, his life. David was honest with her about his fears, his doubts, his desperation to prove himself. And slowly, Jessica's resistance started to melt. Play something for me, she finally said. Something that represents what you'd play at my wedding. David nodded and sat at his keyboard. He closed his eyes, not that it mattered, and started to play. He chose a piece about transformation, about darkness finding light, about two people finding each other in a complicated world. When he finished, Jessica was crying. She wiped her tears quickly, embarrassed. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't expect that. It's okay. Music should make you feel something." Jessica stood up to leave, but paused at the door. "I was scared you'd make my wedding about you. About your disability? About people feeling sorry for you or uncomfortable?" She looked at him, even though he couldn't see her. "But now I'm more scared that if you don't play, I'll be missing something important." "So I can perform?" "Under one condition," Jessica said. "Keep practicing. Keep getting better. Because my father might be satisfied with potential, but I want excellence." David smiled for the first time in weeks. "Deal." After she left, David felt something shift inside him. The pressure was still there, but it felt different now. He wasn't just playing for Vincent's approval or his own validation. He was playing for someone who believed he could be excellent. He picked up his phone and called Patricia, his coach. "I'm ready to work harder," he told her. "Whatever it takes." The night before the wedding, David couldn't sleep at all. He lay in bed staring at nothing like he'd done every night since he was born, but tonight the darkness felt heavier somehow. Tomorrow would either change everything or confirm what he'd secretly feared his whole life, that he'd never be more than what he already was. His phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was Vincent. "Can't sleep either?" Vincent asked, his voice tired but kind. "Not even close," David admitted. "I keep running through the pieces in my head, and every time I find something else to worry about." "Want to know a secret?" Vincent said. "The night before my first big business deal, the one that started my whole empire, I threw up 3 times. I was so scared I almost called the whole thing off." "What stopped you?" "My father. He told me something I've never forgotten. He said being scared means it matters. If you weren't scared, it wouldn't be worth doing." David felt his throat tighten. "I'm terrified, Vincent. What if I freeze up there? What if my hands shake so bad I can't play? What if—" "Then you'll be human," Vincent interrupted gently. "And maybe that's what everyone needs to see. Not perfection, just someone brave enough to try." They talked for another hour, about nothing and everything, about music and fear and hope. When they finally hung up, David still couldn't sleep. But the darkness didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. The wedding was being held at Vincent's estate, a massive property with gardens that looked like something from a magazine. David arrived early, guided by Patricia, who'd agreed to help him get settled. The grand piano they'd brought in for him was beautiful, a concert-quality instrument that responded to the lightest touch. "It's perfect," David said, running his fingers over the keys. "You're going to be perfect, too," Patricia assured him. "Trust yourself." Guests started arriving around 4 in the afternoon. David could hear them from the room where he was waiting, the sound of expensive cars pulling up, high heels clicking on marble floors, voices that carried the confidence of people who'd never worried about money a day in their lives. Vincent found him an hour before the ceremony. "How are you holding up?" Vincent asked. "Ask me again in 2 hours," David said, trying to smile but not quite managing it. "David, listen to me. I need you to know something." Vincent sat down next to him. "Whether you play perfectly tonight or whether you mess up every single note, I'm still going to keep my promise. You've already given me more than I gave you." "What do you mean?" "You reminded me how to feel something real. That's worth more than any perfect performance." Vincent squeezed David's shoulder. "So don't play for me. Don't play for them. Play for you the way you did on that street corner. That's when you're at your best." The ceremony itself was beautiful from what David could hear. Jessica's voice when she said her vows, the quiet crying from her mother, the applause when they were pronounced married. And then it was time for the reception, time for dinner, time for speeches, and then it was time for David. Jessica's maid of honor made the introduction, though David barely heard the words through the rushing sound in his ears. His heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. Patricia guided him to the piano, made sure he was positioned right, then whispered, "You've got this," before stepping away. The room was silent. 300 people watching him, waiting. David could feel their attention like a physical weight. He tried to lift his hands to the keys, but they were shaking too badly. His breathing got shallow. His mind went blank. This was it. He was going to fail. Going to freeze in front of everyone. Going to prove all those directors and managers and orchestra leaders right. He wasn't ready for this level, couldn't handle the pressure. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, he heard a single sound. Someone clearing their throat in a very specific way. 2 short coughs followed by a longer one. It was Vincent's signal, the one they'd practiced. It meant, "I'm here." "You're not alone." David took a deep breath. Then another. He closed his eyes. Not that it mattered, but it helped him focus. He thought about that street corner outside Central Station. Thought about all those mornings playing for nobody. Playing because he had to, because music was the only thing that made sense in a world that had never made sense to him. His hands found the keys, still shaking, but moving now. He started to play. The piece he'd chosen was one he'd written himself 3 years ago, during his first winter on the streets. He'd called it Invisible back then, but he'd never played it for anyone. It started soft and uncertain, like someone trying to find their way in the dark. The melody was simple at first, just a few notes repeated, searching for something. Then it began to build. The left hand added depth, creating a foundation for the right hand to dance on. The melody got more complex, more confident. It was telling a story, his story, of being lost and finding small pieces of light, of being rejected and trying again, of falling down and getting back up. The room had gone completely still. Phones that had been sneaking glances at screens were now forgotten on tables. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the waiters froze in place. David felt the change in his audience and something unlocked inside him. He stopped thinking about technique or tempo or all of Patricia's corrections. He just played, letting the music flow through him the way it had on that street corner, the way it had in his tiny apartment at 3 in the morning, the way it always did when he forgot to be scared. The piece shifted into the second movement, where the darkness starts to break. The melody lifted higher, finding hope in unexpected places. His fingers moved across the keys with absolute certainty now, no hesitation, no doubt. He added a variation he'd never practiced, something that just felt right in this moment, and it worked perfectly. In the audience, Vincent had tears streaming down his face. He wasn't embarrassed by them. He thought about his father, about that accordion music in their tiny kitchen, about all the years he'd wasted being ashamed. He wished his father could be here, could see this, could know that his son had finally remembered what mattered. Jessica was crying too, holding her new husband's hand. This wasn't the elegant background music she'd planned for. This was something bigger, something that made her expensive dress and perfect flowers seem less important than the real connection she felt with everyone in this room. All around them, 300 people who'd seen everything, who'd been everywhere, who thought nothing could surprise them anymore. They were feeling something they hadn't felt in years. Some were crying. Others were smiling with wet eyes. A few just sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they were experiencing. David moved into the final movement, where the lost person finally finds not just light, but themselves. The music swelled with triumph, but it was a quiet triumph, not loud or showy, just certain. The melody that had started searching had found what it was looking for. The notes climbed higher and higher, each one clear and pure and absolutely right. And then, in a moment that took everyone's breath away, David brought it back down to where it started. That same simple melody from the beginning, but now it sounded different. Not lost anymore. Not searching. Just peaceful. Complete. The final note hung in the air for what felt like forever. David kept his hands on the keys, not ready to let go yet, not ready to come back to reality. The silence that followed felt sacred. Nobody wanted to be the first to break it. For maybe 5 full seconds, 300 people just sat there, processing what they'd just experienced. Then someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then everyone at once rising to their feet, applause filling the room like thunder. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of clapping you do because you're supposed to. This was real, raw appreciation for something that had touched them in a place they'd forgotten they had. David stood up from the piano, overwhelmed and disoriented by the noise. Vincent was there immediately, grabbing him in a hug that nearly knocked him over. "You did it," Vincent said, his voice broken with emotion. You did it! Jessica pushed through the crowd to get to him, not caring that she was wrinkling her expensive dress. I don't have words. Thank you. Thank you for playing at my wedding. People started surrounding them, all wanting to talk to David, to thank him, to ask where he'd studied, where he performed, how they could hear him play again. Phone numbers were being pressed into his hands, business cards, invitations to play at other events. One woman who owned a chain of concert halls was already talking about booking him for a series. David couldn't process it all. It was too much, too fast. But Vincent stayed beside him, helping him navigate the crowd, making sure he wasn't overwhelmed. Later that night, after the dancing had ended and most guests had left, David and Vincent sat together in the garden. The sounds of cleanup drifted from inside the house, but out here it was quiet. I've been thinking about what comes next, Vincent said. You're going to get offers after tonight, good ones, but I want you to have something more permanent. I'm setting up a foundation, music education for kids with disabilities. I want you to run it, teach them, inspire them, show them what's possible. David was quiet for a long moment. You're really doing this? Keeping your promise? Every word of it. You moved that crowd exactly like I knew you would. Actually, you did better than that. You changed them. Changed me. Vincent paused. My father would have been proud of you. Would have loved your music. I wish I could have met him. Me too. But in a way, you helped me meet him again. Remember who he was. Who I was before I forgot. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds. David felt different than he had that morning. Not because of the applause or the offers or even Vincent's foundation. He felt different because he'd finally proven something to himself. That he was enough, exactly as he was. 5 years later, David would perform at Lincoln Center. He'd record 3 albums that won awards. He'd teach hundreds of students through Vincent's foundation. But sitting in that garden on that perfect night, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he'd found his voice, and people had listened. And Vincent, who'd spent 40 years chasing success and forgetting his heart, had finally found his way back home.